This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Conquest of the Empire. Conquest of the Empire was originally released in 1984 by Milton Bradley as part of their Game Master series. The game was designed by Larry Harris Jr. of Axis and Allies fame and takes about 3 hours to play. Conquest of the Empire is a tactical war game of internal Roman warfare and politics that takes place during the 2nd century AD. Conquest of the Empire was then re-released again in 2005 by Eagle Gryphon Games. This revised version of Conquest of the Empire includes all new art and figure design, as well as streamlined rules. This version also contains a second rule set for Conquest of the Empire 2, designed by Glenn Drover and Martin Wallace. In this episode, we will be looking at the classic rules for Conquest of the Empire. First, let's look at the game setup. Before we get too deep into setup though, let's take a look at the different game boards. This is the classic 1984 Conquest of the Empire game board. After 30 years, it's still a nice clean design with well-defined borders, shading to help you differentiate between provinces, and the actual artwork on the board has that vintage history textbook feel. In fact, reading online, a lot of folks prefer this game board to the newer version, which I'll show you in just a second. Now, this is the 2005 edition of the game board with art by Paul Niemeyer. As always, Paul Niemeyer's art is gorgeous, and I like how he's integrated Roman mythology vignettes throughout the map. Now, when I show these board sizes, I maximize them to fill as much of the screen as possible. However, if you scale the classic board to the Eagle Games board, you'll see the newer edition is huge. The massive Eagle edition is nearly 4 feet wide by 3 feet tall. Eagle Games loves the shock and awe value of giant boards. Despite the flashier art style, the geography of the boards are essentially the same. For this tutorial, we are going to use the newer Eagle Gryphon version of the game board. If you only own the classic 1984 version of the game, you should be able to follow along as well, as there are no substantial changes to the game's geography. I've also enhanced the board by enlarging the province values to make them easier to see. A special note, I've color-coded the 10 value provinces that serve as starting home provinces in red to make them easier to spot on the board. For gameplay purposes, they're actually gold and worth 10 talents each. Another way to tell the starting locations is to look for the soldiers in each province. If the province has a little soldier in it, then it's a home province. Conquest of the Empire supports up to 6 players. The available starting provinces differ based on the number of players in the game. We will walk through all these variations, but for now, let's discuss the 6-player setup. Now, choosing provinces and colors is up to the mutual agreement of all the players. However, due to the nature of some players, I've devised the following minimum fuss house rule to help players get on with it. To begin, each player is going to roll a 6-sided dice. This establishes the order of play for setup. The player that rolls the lowest value gets to go first, and so on. Using this order, each player will select their color of units from the game box. Now that each color is established, each player will take out the following game pieces. 1 fortified city, which is a fortification miniature with a city miniature resting on top of it. 1 Caesar figure, 4 general figures, and 5 infantry figures. Next, following the setup order of play, each player will select one of the available home provinces. For the purposes of learning setup, I've aligned the selection of the provinces sequentially with the order of play. Player 1's home province is always Macedonia. The remaining players' armies start in provinces encircling the Mediterranean. Player number 2's province is Galatia. Player 3 is Aegyptus. Player 4 is Numidia. Player 5 is Hispania. And player 6 is Italia. This clockwise pattern also establishes the order of play for the final game. Next, each player is going to take out one of their control markers. These control markers will all be placed on position 15 on the tribute track at the bottom of the board. Now, let's look at the different starting province locations based on different numbers of players. The 5-player game. Player 1 is in Macedonia, Player 2 in Mesopotamia, Player 3 in Aegyptus, Player 4 in Hispania, and Player 5 in Italia. The 4-player game. Player 1 in Macedonia, Player 2 in Mesopotamia, Player 3 in Numidia, and Player 4 in Hispania. The 3-player game. Player 1 in Macedonia, Player 2 in Aegyptus, and Player 3 in Hispania. And finally, the 2-player game. Player 1 in Aegyptus, and Player 2 in Hispania. Now that we have the game board set up, let's look at the gameplay. Let's return to our 6-player game. At the beginning of the game, each player's starting units are consolidated in their home province. Most of the provinces on the board are undefended. Therefore, to conquer one only requires that a player moves a legion into it. When a player conquers a new province, place a control marker on it to tell the other players who owns it. This instigates a land rush mechanic where each player is trying to grab as many provinces as possible. Now, in this early stage of the game, players must judge the extent of their expansion carefully. If a player spreads their legions too thin, they may be overrun by neighboring players. If they hold back their legions too much, then other players will scoop up all the available provinces and become economically superior. Each conquered province has an assigned value. A silver province is worth 5 tribute per turn. A gold province is worth 10 tribute per turn. For every province claimed by a player, they move their control marker at the bottom of the board on the tribute track forward by that tribute amount. During each player's turn, the amount of tribute they've earned is paid out in the game's currency, called talent. The talent colors match up with the colors of the coins on the board. A silver province gives you 5 tribute, which means that you'll be paid out 5 talents per turn. A gold province will pay out 10 talents per turn. As you can see, these early conquests will quickly lead into conflict with neighboring players, which forms the heart of the gameplay. The ultimate goal is for one player to eliminate his rivals and assume power over Rome as the only remaining Caesar. Now, with these fundamentals in mind, let's learn about legions and how to use them to conquer provinces. Colored gameplay units are divided into 2 groups: leaders and combat units. Leaders are composed of Caesars and generals. Leaders can move, but they can't fight. Combat units are composed of infantry, cavalry, and catapults. On their own, combat units can fight, but they can't move. When you add one leader unit to at least one combat unit, they form a legion. Legions can move and fight. Legions are composed of up to 7 units, at least one leader and 6 other units. A critical point to be aware of: the Caesar figure is your main figure in the game. While a Caesar can be used to form legions, if that legion is conquered and you lose the Caesar, you lose the game. So be very careful when you deploy your Caesar and make sure he is always protected. In Conquest of the Empire, each player's turn is divided into 6 phases: movement, combat, collect tribute, destroy cities, purchase new units, and place new units. Now let's look at each of these phases in greater detail. The first phase of a player's turn is movement. Each unit in the game has a movement range measured in the number of provinces it can travel. Leader units, like the Caesar and the General, can move 2 provinces per turn. Leader units can move on their own or with a legion. The next group are infantry and catapults. These units cannot move unless they are led as part of a legion by a general or a Caesar. Infantry and catapults are slower and only can travel 1 province per turn. Therefore, when traveling as part of a legion, the legion's maximum speed is 1 province per turn. Finally, the last member of land units are cavalry. These units cannot move unless they are led, as part of a legion, by a general or a Caesar. These units can travel 2 provinces per turn. Now the unit movement may seem a little slow. That's where roads come in. A player that owns cities in adjacent provinces can build a road between them. With multiple cities, you can chain multiple roads together. The advantages of roads is that traveling along one counts as one movement. Therefore, players can move their legions greater distances more quickly following a network of roads. So keep this in mind when you're building out your cities. Finally, we have naval units called galleys. Galleys can travel across sea zones and can transport 1 legion. Remember, legions are composed of up to 7 units. Galleys are not part of legions. They are transports that can move on their own without a leader figure. Galleys can travel up to 2 zones. Provincial shorelines count as a zone, and sea areas count as a zone. For example, docking or launching from a provincial coastline is considered 1 movement. And traveling from one sea zone to another sea zone is considered 1 movement. In Phase 2, players conduct combat. Combat occurs when one player's units enter a province or sea zone with another player's units. The player whose units occupy the province or sea zone first is the defender. The player whose units enter the province or sea zone after that is considered the attacker. To illustrate the mechanics of combat, let's draw out a battle board. Let's say the attacker side is on the left and the defender side is on the right. We'll divide these 2 groups by a skirmish line. The attacking side always has a leader. The defending side may or may not have a leader present, but for this example, let's say there's a leader present. Remember, leaders can't fight. Each side is then going to draw up their battle legion. Each side's battle legion can be comprised of up to 5 units. Also, for each leader participating, the battle legion gets 1 additional bonus unit. Any excess units involved in the battle are placed in reserve. Now let's create our combat scenario with some figures. For the red attackers, we have 1 general, 3 infantry, 2 cavalry, and 1 catapult. For the blue defenders, let's say they have 1 general and 6 infantry. We're also going to give the blue defenders 1 fortified city. The 2005 edition of the game uses customized combat dice with symbols on each face. The number of dice a side gets to roll is determined by the number of units in their battle legion. Remember, leaders do not fight, so they do not add a dice to the pool. One addition to this rule is if the defender has a fortified city in their province, then they get to roll 2 additional combat dice. Unless the attacker has at least 1 catapult, then the defender only gets to roll 1 additional combat dice. So in this example, the red attacker would get to roll 6 attack dice. The blue defender would get to roll 6 attack dice plus 1 for having a city, but the enemy has 1 catapult. The objective of rolling the combat dice is to roll the symbol of the units in your battle legion. Whenever you roll a symbol of a unit in your battle legion, that counts as 1 hit against the enemy. One way to keep this organized is to roll your dice and then place a matching dice result behind the appropriate unit in the battle legion. In our battle board example, I call this the dice lane. Using our attacking battle legion as an example, let's say we rolled an infantry result. Take that result, slide it down the dice lane, and place it next to the first unit of that symbol. If you cannot match up that symbol with an available figure in your battle legion, then that result is considered a miss. If the red attacking player wants to make a hit with his cavalry or his catapult, he needs to roll those symbols. A quick exception to the rules. If you don't have a catapult in your battle legion, but you have one in reserve, if you roll a catapult symbol, you can score a hit from there as well. Besides the catapult exception, if you roll the symbol of a unit that's not in your battle legion, then you miss. For example, on the blue defender side, any unit besides an infantry that's rolled is considered an automatic miss. In land battles, galley symbols are a miss for either side. The player suffering the hit gets to decide which of his units he wants to sacrifice. Those units are then eliminated and removed from the battle legion. In the next round of combat, that player can move any units from reserve to fill those gaps in the battle legion. A combat round is broken up into 3 steps. First, players organize their units and choose which units they're going to place in their frontline battle legion. Next, combat occurs. Each player rolls dice and they remove eliminated units. Next, each player, starting with the defender, decides whether they're going to continue the battle or retreat. The player that chooses retreat must survive pursuit before they can escape. The pursuing player gets to roll 1 attack dice for each unit in his remaining force. Any unit surviving this final pursuit attack can move to an adjacent friendly province. However, even if all the combat units are destroyed by the pursuers, generals and Caesar units automatically escape and retreat successfully. If both players choose to continue the battle, then the steps repeat themselves until either a player declares retreat or all units on one side are eliminated. Now, if the battle continues through to the bitter end, the winner gets to decide what to do with the losers, general or Caesar. Now, if the battle continues till the bitter end, the winner gets to decide what to do with the loser's general. If the loser's legion is a Caesar, then that player is eliminated from the game. However, with a general, the winner can decide to either eliminate the general or hold the general for ransom. Generals can be ransomed in Phase 6 place units. And that, in a nutshell, is how land combat works in the revised 2005 edition of Conquest of the Empire. Naval combat has been greatly streamlined in the revised edition. All naval combat lasts a maximum of 3 rounds. Each side gets to roll 2 combat dice per galley involved in the naval battle. Rolling a galley symbol equals a hit and destroys 1 galley as well as all passengers on board. The player suffering the hit gets to choose which galley sustains the hit. And that's it. It's that simple. Now, let's look at the original 1984 combat system. In the 1984 combat system, players roll standard 6-sided dice. For example, with infantry, a dice roll of 4 or higher is required to eliminate the unit. Cavalry are split between land and sea. On land, 5 or higher is required to eliminate a cavalry unit. On sea, a 4 is required. A catapult can only be destroyed on a roll of 6, and a galley can be destroyed on a roll of 3 or higher. Perhaps the most famous part of the original rules, though, is the combat advantage system. Larry Harris designed the combat advantage system to add some spice to the game. The overall concept is simple. For each catapult or fortified city in play, a player receives a +1 to their dice roll. For example, a player with a catapult in their battle legion now only has to roll a 3 to eliminate an infantry unit. The more catapults in the battle legion, the higher the combat advantage. In many players' minds, this unbalanced the game as it put a lot of focus on getting as many catapults as you could as quickly as possible. Now let's look at the original combat rules and you can see one approach to dealing with the catapult problem. Besides battle advantage, the 1984 combat system was much more tactically oriented. Let's look at our example from the revised combat rules and I'll show you the difference. Starting with the attacker, that player selects an unused unit from their battle legion. The player calculates the combat advantage, declares their target, and rolls the attack dice. If they score a hit, they remove the target. If not, they continue. Gameplay alternates to the defender and they select an unused unit from their battle legion. The defender calculates their combat advantage, then declare their target to the opposing player. The difference in strategy here is that the defender can select the catapult as its target. If the defender is successful in eliminating the catapult, then it also affects the attacker's combat advantage. The defender then rolls the dice and sees if they eliminate the catapult. The dice roll is a 5 with a combat advantage of +1, which equals 6. This is the amount necessary to destroy the catapult. The catapult is destroyed and the combat advantage for the attacker is now reduced to 0. This is the reason you're constantly calculating combat advantage as part of the steps. By eliminating catapults, combat advantage can be modified during combat. This continues alternating back and forth between attacker and defender until all units have been used up. Now you can see the major differences between the original combat system and the revised combat system. Now let's take a brief look at the difference in the 1984 naval combat rules. When naval combat occurs, no retreats are allowed. Essentially, naval combat plays out the same as land combat except for the units are on galleys. The galleys themselves cannot be targeted and destroyed until all the passengers on board have been eliminated. If players have multiple galleys in a fleet with legions on board, they must identify which units are on which ship. As you can see, galley combat in the 1984 version was just as complicated as land combat. In naval combat, catapults still provide a combat advantage. Cavalry can be hit with a 4 versus a 5 because they're essentially treated as infantry at sea. When revising the game, the designer obviously felt this was a little too drawn out and convoluted. However, if your imagination goes wild at the thought of shipboardings and hand-to-hand combat, fighting to the last man, then you might want to incorporate the 1984 naval combat rules into your game. Now, let's get back to the phases of gameplay. In Phase 3, players collect tribute. When a player collects tribute, they reference the tribute track at the bottom of the board. Each player receives tribute in the game's currency called talent. The amount of talent collected is determined by the value of each province owned and whether that province contains a city or not. Silver provinces are worth 5 talents each, and gold and red provinces are worth 10 talents each. Each player also gets 5 additional talents if that province contains a city or a fortified city. In Phase 4, players have the option to destroy their own cities. If they feel threatened by an approaching enemy army, players have the option at this point to destroy their city. If a player fears that his province is about to be conquered by another player, that player has the option in this phase to destroy their own city. The strategy behind this is it prevents an enemy player from taking the province and the city as well. Destroying the city also eliminates any roads connected to it. Removing roads also has the benefit of slowing down the enemy army from using the road system to their own advantage. Remember, when destroying a city, a player needs to adjust their marker on the tribute track. In the 5th phase, players may purchase new units. Prices were modified in the revised edition, so they're slightly different in the 1984 version. Let's look at the 2005 price, and you can compare that to the 1984 prices listed below. Infantry costs 10 talents each. Cavalry or galleys cost 20 talents each. Catapults cost 30 talents each. For city units, a new city costs 30 talents. Building a fortification around the city costs 20 talents. And a new connecting road costs 10 talents. New land units are placed in the player's home province. City pieces can be placed in provinces that the player owns. Galleys are placed along the home province's shoreline. One interesting gameplay mechanic of Conquest of the Empire is the concept of inflation. Historically, the Roman Empire often suffered from sudden surges of inflation. In Conquest of the Empire, inflation is reflected by using the tribute track. At the beginning of the game, all players' control markers begin in the bronze coins section of the tribute scale. However, as soon as one player amasses enough tribute to pass over into the silver coin area, then inflation is triggered. Once this occurs, players are allowed one last chance to purchase new units, and then in all subsequent rounds, prices are doubled. Inflation affects all players, and there's no going back. The first player that amasses enough tribute to pass over into the gold coins section triggers the second inflation. Once again, there's a last chance to purchase new units in the current round, and then after that, all prices are tripled. The 6th and final phase in the round is placing new units. Land units are placed in the player's home province. City units can be placed in provinces that the player owns. Galley units are placed along the home province's coast. During this phase, players may also ransom generals. Ransom amounts and any special agreements are totally up to the players. To gain these abilities back, the green player must retake their home province of Macedonia. Now, let's talk about what happens when a player loses their home province. Occasionally, a player will conquer another player's home province and force them into exile. In this example, the red player has conquered the green player's home province of Macedonia. In this instance, the green player surrenders all their remaining talents to the red player, who now owns their treasury. The green player cannot buy new units or place new units because they don't have a home province. Otherwise, they're probably not going to survive much longer in the game, as they'll be whittled down and eventually eliminated. Therefore, it's a good strategy to not only keep your Caesars safe, but your home province defended as well. In Conquest of the Empire, winning the game is not about conquering all the provinces or earning the most tribute. The way to win the game is to eliminate all the other Caesars. The last Caesar standing wins the game. It's that simple. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to play Conquest of the Empire, both the 1984 rules and the new 2005 revised rules. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. Until then, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.